I think, Jim, you're exactly right. Of course, the U.S. could, if it wanted to, quote, lead by actually doing something constructive rather than totally defensive in using the veto. What's happening in the UN, of course, is nearly complete isolation of the US and Israel vis-a-vis the rest of the world. In the Security Council, with the 15 votes, the most recent call for a ceasefire went 13 to 1 to 1. So 13 members voted for a ceasefire. The United States vetoed that call, and the UK, ever loyal, abstained. And by the way, abstained even though the public pressures in the UK to stop this massacre are actually quite strong on the streets, with mass demonstrations taking place regularly in London. Then the vote went to the UN General Assembly under a doctrine that when there is a paralysis in the Security Council, it can be taken up by the UN General Assembly in a operational move that Dean Acheson actually established a little over 70 years ago, called Uniting for Peace. So it went to the UN General Assembly, and there the vote was 153 calling for an immediate ceasefire, 10 opposed, the United States, Israel, and 8 small countries, and 23 abstaining, with 7 very small countries not voting for one reason or another. Maybe their representative wasn't actually in New York or something like that. So the vote was 153 yes, 10 opposed, and 23 abstaining. If you calculate the populations in each of those categories, turns out that in the 153 governments that voted for the immediate ceasefire, that's 89% of the world's population in the countries of those 153 votes. The countries in the no vote, the US category, is 5% of the world population, of which the US is 4%, and the other 9 countries, Israel, Guatemala, Paraguay, and some really small islands, that turns out to be 5% total, and we're 4% of that. So the countries that joined the US on the vote constitute 1% of the world population. Then the abstentions is another 5% of the world population in those 23 countries. And then the 7 not voting is a little under 1%. So you get 100%. Okay. And my point is, just to finish the point, the US is essentially isolated now. That isolation is going to actually intensify in the coming weeks. The US is basically, Israel always says, we don't care. You're all a bunch of anti-Semites or whatever they claim. But the United States does care. To be completely alone in the world, other than with Israel, really hurts American interests all over the world. And that's what's actually happening right now. So my view is this pressure is going to continue to intensify. We're seeing a mass slaughter every day, and the vote isn't going to be 153 next time. It's going to be 165 next time, or 170, because we see even the likes of the UK, France, Germany saying we need a ceasefire now because they're hearing it from their own publics. So the United States is basically standing alone next to Israel, and that's it.
Dr. Sachs, why hasn't there any effective carrot and stick policy with Israel? Like, we've only seen reward after reward, but we haven't seen.
Yes, there is no stick, because the American politicians want to show that they're on the side of Israel. That's been their traditional modus operandi. And this is the main point. They're starting to realize it doesn't work. doesn't work for geopolitics. It doesn't work for their own vote. It doesn't work for the public. So I think that there is some worry, because also what's happening, what we see on the videos, what we see in the television every day is beyond shocking. It's mass murder of a civilian population in broad, clear daylight. No murmur of attempt at diplomacy by Israel. Quite the contrary, a complete denial of any intention of Palestinian rights now or after the fighting. Quite the contrary, Netanyahu came out and said, well, Oslo process, that was a mistake. We will never allow the Palestinian Authority to have control over Gaza. We will keep control over Gaza. In other words, it's vulgar, and it is a war for Israel to have full control over everything. And if that means mass slaughter and ethnic cleansing, Israel will go ahead. The question is, will the United States provide the munitions each day for this? And as I say, the training of these politicians is, yes, don't show space with Israel. That's been the way for decades. The vulgarity of this and the criminality of it and the fact that it doesn't play with the public and the isolation of the United States in the world will force a re-examination of these basic precepts. And how fast or not that will happen is exactly what we're seeing right now. I'm trying to do anything I can to see more votes that show the U.S. isolation, that draw clearly that this is the whole world speaking out for justice and for stopping of the war. The American politicians, they have a high tolerance for people being killed. They've been killing people for a long, long time, but not in such a vivid way on the screen, so clear every day.
There is one point, but I'll come back and just
Sure.
as a follow-up to this. There is one point that I don't think may, or I don't know if it's being made enough. I'd love to get your take on it. But one of the biggest arguments that Israel has in the, to the international community, it's right to defend itself, and I get that point. But in looking at some of the numbers that came out of the 2006 war in Lebanon and the crucial role that the UN played through resolution number 1701, highlights a couple of really interesting points. One, between the year 1982 and 2000, when Israel was occupying the south of Lebanon, there were about, I think, 12 to 1,300 soldiers, Israeli soldiers, that were killed. From 2000 to 2022, 23, that number went down by about 97.5% to, I think, 28, if you put aside the 2006 war. 2006 war essentially was a war for the release of Lebanese prisoners. They took the two soldiers, and ultimately, even though the war ended up doing a lot of destruction and death as usual, the prisoners were exchanged, and all of the Lebanese prisoners were released from Israeli prisons. Now, interestingly, the lesson from that war is between 2006 and 2023, the border has been, I'd say, relatively quiet. Some flare-ups here and there, but nothing major. They even signed an oil and gas deal just last year. One of the points that I think is missing, and I'd love to get your take on it, is if the Land for Peace model were to be reconsidered, there is a proof point that it works, and it still works. It worked in Egypt, it worked in Jordan, it worked in Lebanon, and it reduced from the amount of Israeli deaths, as proven by a 97.5% drop in the amount of dead Israeli soldiers. I'd love to get your take on this and the important role that the UN, through 1701 and so many other resolutions, played in making it happen, and whether there is such an opening now, notwithstanding the U.S. reticence to actually, to go for it along UN lines.
Well, you make a very good point, and it is, of course, my own position that we should move immediately to the two-state outcome. My own proposal is that the UN Security Council should immediately vote Palestine as the 194th UN member state. It could do that in principle next week because Palestine made its application in September 2011. It's been pending for a dozen years. The first application was blocked by the United States. Palestine accepted observer status under US pressure. But now I think under the current realities, the Security Council should try, and probably the US would veto it, but I would try anyway, for an immediate recognition of Palestine as the 194th UN member state based on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, as called for by all relevant UN Security Council resolutions going back to 242 and 338 and many, many others since then. So this is what I would recommend, and I do think that it could lead to peace. And of course, the fact is that the Arab Peace Initiative, which was first launched in 2002, is exactly predicated on this. The Arab states have said repeatedly, we will normalize relations with Israel, we will make peace with Israel, based on a two-state solution on the 4 June 1967 borders. And when the Arab and Islamic leaders met in Riyadh about a month ago now and issued the declaration, they cited the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which has been repeated many times since then, and they reiterated in their own words. And importantly, that included Iran as well as the Arab countries, that peace is possible. There needs to be an immediate end to the fighting, and there needs to be a state of Palestine, sovereign and with the borders of June 4, 1967. So this, to my mind, is the right approach. Now, why isn't it happening? Well, it's not happening precisely because this government in Israel, and arguably just about every government of the last 50 years, isn't really interested in that kind of peace. They're not really looking fundamentally for that kind of security in which they have a normalization of relations with Arab countries based on two states. They're really looking for one state. They're really looking for one state, that is Israel, which, as they say, using biblical terms, includes not only present-day Israel, but also Judea and Samaria, meaning the West Bank, and Gaza. And so that's what this is about. Of course, what's happened in Israel over the last 50 years is that it's become more and more and more right-wing and extreme nationalist. And the Netanyahu government is an extremist government by any account. It's not even close. There's nobody in the government that talks about two states. Quite the contrary. Netanyahu said very explicitly, no way to two states. And some of the senior cabinet ministers, like the finance minister Smotrich, he calls himself a fascist, by the way, maybe in a jocular way, but he says fascist. Yeah, sure. And his party is the party for so-called Greater Israel. What does Greater Israel mean? It means that Israel will control all of the territory of Palestine and present-day Israel. So this is very deep politically. You have Gallant, the finance minister. You have Ben-Gvir. You have Smotrich. You have Netanyahu. These are the leaders. They're not fighting a war for Hamas. They are fighting a war for Israel to have full control over Gaza and the West Bank. And that's why they're not saying, well, if Hamas would somehow be defeated, we'd go to a two-state solution. Exactly the opposite. And this makes what they're doing not only war crimes per se, but
nonsensical,
all the more vile. There's no endpoint to it. It's pure war, pure ethnic cleansing, and that is their vision.